Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second session of the DAIDALOS project, the discussion series on AI research and social responsibility, organized by the Artificial Intelligence Center and supported by the Machine Learning meetups in Prague. The Artificial Intelligence Center is based at the Czech Technical University in Prague. I'm very happy to introduce you to this discussion panel on post-human creativity, where we will explore the relations between AI and creativity. More specifically, we will see how contemporary artists do use and exploit AI for their creations. The title for our discussion series was inspired by the mythological ancient Greek character of Daedalus, who, other than a genius inventor, craftsman, and architect, he was also an artist and a sculptor as well. And this somehow tells us that already in ancient time there was a clear awareness of the connections and relations between art and technology. So we couldn't have done without a session dedicated to creativity. Today, we are bringing to you a rich and international panel composed by the artists Gareth Lynch from Ireland, Paul Moginot from France, and Iskra Velichkova from Bulgaria. The discussion will be moderated by the Italian Filippo Lorenzin. Filippo is an art writer, teacher, and media theorist based in Venice, Italy, and he's experienced in contemporary art, digital culture, and education. He collaborated with major cultural institutions such as the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the Goethe Institute, and the Paris College of Art. Currently is working for the Peggy Guggenheim Foundation in Venice and for the Museum of Contemporary Digital Art. So here's Filippo.
Hi,
hello. And his research as an art historian focuses on digital culture, and he writes in magazines such as Flash Art, Hyperallergic, and Motherboard. So last few words before Filippo takes the floor, let me just remind you that you can post your questions on the dedicated Slido page. You can see the link in the banner here below. We'll answer your question after the panel discussion. So this is all for me. Filippo, see you after the panel discussion. You take the floor.
Oh my gosh. Thank you, Antonio. Thank you for inviting me and our guests to this call. It truly is an honor to discuss one of the most prominent aspects of contemporary new media art, namely the creative application of AI technology. This evening, we will discuss what it means to make art with AI and how this relatively new practice affects our understanding of what we usually define as creativity, human ingenuity, and artistic skills. I wanted to involve experts whose experience in their fields has led them to reevaluate, to explore the meaning of working with digital technology. To give an example, if in the 19th century painters would have never considered their brushes as something more than tools, there are now more and more contemporary artists who introduce their practices as the product, as the result of a collaboration with AI, which is presented as an ally rather than, just a tool. The artistic use of AI challenges some of the cornerstones of the modern Western concepts of art and creativity. The artist who works with AI blurs the lines that traditionally define the roles played by makers and their tools. To what degree can we call AI-generated works as the product of genuine creativity? To answer these and many other questions this evening, I have three very special guests. So it's a great honor to introduce them to you. Gareth Lynch, IRL, is an artist. Hi, Gareth. Is an artist, lecturer, curator, and theorist. His work explores networks in their most open sense within an artistic context, the spaces between artists, artworks, and audience as a means, site and context for artistic initiation, creation, and discourse. Garrett's networked practice spans online art, performance, installation, and writing. Currently exploring generative adversarial networks, his focus is on the creation of text and images that are created through various forms of folding, both within the GAN and in connection with other networks. Postgraduate of interactive research at the École Nationale Supérieure des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, France, of course, and PhD of networked art at South Bank University in London, Garrett has taught on many new media courses throughout England, Wales, and India. He is currently Associate Professor at the School of Cultural Technology, Xi'an Xiaotung Liverpool University in China. So thank you, Garrett, for joining us this evening. Our second guest is Paul Moschino. He is an artist. He is from Paris. He's an artist, engineer, and Paul, and founder of the artistic collective Aure's Métier, whose aim is to understand how relevant and meaningful interactions with machines and algorithms can be achieved in order to push the boundaries of creative processes. So thank you, Paul, for joining us this evening as well.
Thank you very much.
Our third, last but not the least, guest is Iskra Velichkova. She's a Bulgarian. Hi, Iskra. She's a Bulgarian artist currently based in Madrid. Her work explores the present and potential interactions between humans and machines, and how, instead of making technology more human, this relationship can push us to understand our limits better. After a proven record in the tech and artificial intelligence industry as a visual thinker, Iskra decided to apply her knowledge and experience at the service of her own research. Now, without further ado, I would like to start by asking our guest when and why they started working with AI and automation. Iskra, can you tell us something about this?
Yeah, I just reconnected now because I lost my connection. So if you can just make a question.
Absolutely, sorry. I just said that I would like to start by asking you and Garrett and Paul, when and why you started working with AI.
Okay, so I come from data visualization world, and first with my own studio when it was like the hype of data and big data, and we had to just gather all this information, getting patterns and these kind of things. And then I left this hype, and then I faced the new one, which was the algorithms. So once we knew how to deal with data, the algorithms came. And I was at that time in a big corporation there, leading a database team there. So I decided just to switch more into science because I really needed to understand what were those algorithms about. Mm-hmm. And my mission there was to disseminate to our clients and to society, because I was working in a huge bank. So I thought we had like a responsibility for society, because we were building products based on data, for the money. And we were building algorithms which were very important for decisions for the people. And that's how I entered in the center of excellence there, and I was surrounded by great scientists there, and I got really into the world. And I don't know, I spent a few years there, and I just decided that I needed more. I needed like just get more close to the art, just to can push more AI, but not looking for a result or for a concrete product. I needed to do something like very free to discover new things with AI. So the past years ago, I just got so much into AI to go further.
That's very interesting. Garrett, what about you?
Relatively recently, I've only started working with AI since 2020. A lot of the reasons behind that are to do with accessibility, how it's opened up a lot, very dramatically in about the last year and a half. The reason why I've started working with it is there's a combination of factors. Firstly, the accessibility plays a part in that these tools have become available and we can sort of play with them a little bit. but also it fits well with my practice of networks. It fits within that and how I'm able to sort of use it within that larger practice of networks. So yeah.
Thank you, Gareth. Paul, I think that somehow your story resembles Iskra's story to a certain degree.
Yes, a little bit. I'm an engineer by trade, so I studied a lot mathematics and computer science when I was a kid, I could say. And then I started a few years later a small company specialized in image recognition with two other partners. And at the time, we were working for fashion brands to help them benchmark their competitors. And it was one of the first, I would say, real-world applications for an SME of this type of computer vision algorithms. And what was interesting in this field, as Gareth says, is that it was we started it back in 2015. So at the time, the mathematics were ready, but not really the implementable algorithms. So there are many things we had to craft ourselves, especially the model training farm, if you will, because there was no easy interface to use. So we had to create it ourselves. And in the company, my friend Anis was developing, I would say, the core technology, but myself, I was mostly in charge of training the algorithms. And I established, I can't say a relationship because it's a machine, but a kind of a bond with this type of algorithms where we had to push the AI, we had to understand how much a data set would mess the final output, how you could improve it to get what you want. And honestly, I fell in love with the process. In parallel, I was always fascinated by art. I've been a collector for many years. My first salary, actually, with it, I bought art pieces. And at some point, I said, with all the models I trained, etc., there is something to be done on a craftsmanship level. And that's why I created Horace Vétier Studio. Actually, Horace Vétier is a first name and a last name generated with Markov chains based on all the artists I like. And it's like a unisex name. It's just a unisex name. And the idea is that I'm not hiding myself behind a pseudonym or whatever. It's just to get a collective feeling. And when I do projects now involving AI, but also craftsmanship techniques, usually we are part of a team. And the ego, I leave the ego just like you leave your ego when you interact with the machine. So I'm very happy to be with you all today.
That's very interesting. Speaking of which, I wonder if each of you could tell us, which roles do AI and automation play in your artistic practice? Speaking of which, Paul, I know that you collaborate with AI to propose new paradigms. It's a very difficult word.
Yes,
paradigms.
it is.
Trying to reach maximum hybridity between human curation and technological expertise. I wonder if you could expand on this.
Yes, so hybridity is a word we hear a lot. It's like AI or blockchain. It's almost becoming bullshit words. So for me, honestly, it's a triple aspect of hybridity that I'm trying to reach. First of all, in the concept, because what I'm trying to do as a work corpus is pieces that without the human wouldn't have, this type of sensuality or imperfection or interesting aspect, but without the machine or the algorithms couldn't have been done. So I'm super interested in really, again, I'm going to drop a bullshit word, but the frontier. But I really like, when you need both of these aspects, and it's not that easy to reach because, and at some point, also it was a way of working that was a bit counter balancing so-called new media artists that were mostly focusing on creating the best machines possible to get the best possible output, and then labeling it as pieces of finished product. So that's what I'm trying to reach. Also in the fabrication process, because again, I like to mix pure data transformation with craftsmanship, and in French we call it métier d'art. So I like to work with bronze artisans. I like to work with painters that are able to transform an image into an oil painting. So if it's possible, I will show just some image to show you.
Yes, please.
But it's going to be very fast. But here, I don't know if you see my screen, but
Yes.
it's an example of one of the recent pieces that are very important in the terms of proof of concept. So what I did here is very simple. I took my cat that I love in my apartment, and I just created a data set of him standing on a stool. It was a tribute also to Joseph Beuys, who made a work at some point called Brightly Lit Chair. And I trained a GAN, obviously, on all this data set. And at some point, one of the images that were generated, of course, recreated the atmosphere, but I got this cat with 4 eyes, very enigmatic and very interesting. And I said, it can't remain a picture. It can't remain a JPEG file. It can't be an NFT or whatever. It has to be an object. And I didn't know how to paint, but I know how to create a technology. I love art. I respect painting. But I really wanted to create an object. So it took me a lot of time, but I got in touch with a super fascinating craftsman that is able to turn JPEGs into oil paintings. And we're collaborating on some pieces, such as this one. And this piece now has won a prize in a South Korean AI art competition, and also is featured in the Computer Vision Art Gallery, curated by Luba Elliott especially. So I encourage you to check this gallery because you have many examples of artists playing with AI. So it's just one example, and more recently, I push it always more the practice, and right now I'm working on an algorithm that maybe Iskra or Garrett will talk about later, called Clip. And the idea of Clip is that you can, it's made by OpenAI, and with Clip you can turn a single line of text into an image. So it's super fascinating, in terms of just imagination and interacting with machines. And here it's, I just wrote a birded man working on a completely beige painting, and I got this surrealist painting that now, again, it's surrealist image, sorry, that now I'm turning into a painting. So it's just 2 examples of very concrete objects. You can do many more aspects, but this is the type of work I like and interaction with algorithms that I like.
That's super interesting. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Of course, Garrett, Iskra, if you have any questions or if you have any comments about, about what Paul said, and Paul, if you have any comments about what Garrett and Iskra will say, all of you, of course, feel welcome, to
I was just going to add, Paul mentioned about Clip there. I mean, Clip is one of the technologies that has come out well, it's become accessible in literally the last 6 months. That, we can start combining it with various types of GANs where you can input language and get it to render GANs. But what's really interesting about it is if you play with Clip for long enough, because Clip is a natural language processing tool, if you play with it long enough, you can manipulate it in various ways to sort of interpret styles, to tell it what to do, but also to interpret what to do. And there's lots of things you can do. You can also collaborate with it on various levels, both initially before you trigger the GAN, as the GAN is running, and in a sort of an ongoing process, which is really, really very interesting.
So speaking of which, Garrett, I know that your practice is focused on networks, as you mentioned earlier. And your latest project uses a generative adversarial network visual classifier. So I wonder, if you could tell more about this work and, and your experience with AI. If I'm not wrong, the title should be The Last Straw.
Yes. I'll just share my screen so I can
be my guest.
Please. Okay, can you see my screen?
I think we do, yes.
Okay, so The Last Straw is, at face value, it's effectively a Twitter bot. So Twitter bots post things to Twitter at regular intervals, whether it's text or images. But this is a sort of a more complicated Twitter bot. What's going on in the background is a little bit more complicated. So to get it to function, it's using a search engine to search for images that are in the public domain. that match the word query of straw, just the word straw. And then the images are organized and classified both through a GAN and also through the analysis of the keywords that are associated with the images on the internet. And they're compiled into a grid in a high resolution image. They're overlaid with the classification percentage that is evaluated from the classification. The date, the time, a series number as if it's a sort of part of a series of artistic prints. And then the final image is then posted to Twitter. And this happens automatically every day until the classification percentage that's shown within the images either reaches 0%, which indicates that there's no more natural straw has been located on the internet, or it reaches 100%, where only natural straw is located. And at that point, the work terminates. So that's the sort of functionality of the work, as it were. The work can be thought of as similar, I guess, to something like a weather station, where what it does is it quantitatively measures and documents information about an environment. But in the instance of the last straw, what it's doing is it's measuring not the local environment of a particular physical area, it's instead measuring the environment as a whole, and then effectively what that means to the Anthropocene epoch. So instead of just reporting what has happened or what is happening in terms of what a weather station will do, instead its intent is to also be sort of predictive, to suggest how the future might develop as a result of this evaluation of straw on the internet. So in this respect, the work is both about the now, what's currently happening in the Anthropocene, but it's also speculative of the future. It's about the real occurrence of the disappearance of straw. This is a simple thing, but it's also about what might actually happen as a result of that disappearance of the straw. So it's sort of projecting into the future and trying to imagine that, you know, if all the straw disappears, where will we arrive at? So the work plays on that in many levels. The title of the work makes reference to this idiom, the straw that broke the camel's back, which I repeatedly read this in English idiom, but I'm really not convinced about it, because you don't get camels very often in England. And it does this, it uses that idiom essentially as part of a way of rationalizing how it's using this predictive aspect, because what it's doing is it's measuring a small aspect of the environment. It's sampling the environment, which is what science does all the time. You know, scientists go out and they will take a sample from a river to evaluate the pH levels of a river, or they will conduct a survey to find out what a population is thinking about something. So it takes this idea of a small sample, so the straw is the small sample, and then it will make bigger conclusions based on that sampling. For me, what's interesting in the work, you know, with all of that in mind, there's three things that are interesting about the work for me, and sort of why I set out to do this. Obviously, there's the idea of working with the issue of the Anthropocene, which is very current at the moment. But for me, in my larger practice, the work is a network. It's a network of a lot of technologies. There's the internet itself, there's the search engine that it uses, there's an AI API, there's an image processing library, and there's a system scheduler, which are all working in collaboration together, as well as with myself, to produce these posts of these images every day. So it's essentially a network of these technologies. And then secondly, what's interesting for me is the fact that it plays out over a period of time, which is at regular intervals. It's at every day at the same time, but it's also for an indeterminate amount of time. I don't know when this work will complete, this what is effectively a performance by proxy. I don't know when it will complete, and I don't know how it will complete. The outcome could be one of two things. An aspect of that is also that I don't know if I want it to complete, because if it does, that could be a very worrying thing. And then finally, the last aspect is just really, really important to clarify that even though it's doing this image analysis of images that are on the internet, what's actually happening is it's analyzing images that people have taken, photographs, that people have taken. So what it's actually doing is it's not going out and measuring nature per se and the quantity of straw that's in nature. What it's doing is it's actually measuring the perception of straw by people, whether it's a natural straw, whether it's an artificial straw.
It's a very interesting project.
Yeah.
What I especially like about this is how, although of course the work takes place online, I think it somehow resembles some of my favorite land art works, in terms of time scale and in terms of not actually knowing, when or if it will end. And of course, there is all this interest, of course, in the planet, and after all, in our future as as humankind, I suppose. No, thank you, Gary.
Yes.
That was very interesting.
Absolutely.
That was great. I think we will go back to your practice in a second. First, I would like to learn more about Iskra's approach to AI. You stated on your website that you do not think we should make technology more human, that that we have to push technology forward to understand us better. So how this relate to your art practice?
Yeah. Well, I think we are kind of creating new forms of life now, or we say that, and I think we are enough people, so we don't need to create more like us. So we are like trying to do robots like behaving like humans, or the UX approaches like in the physical spaces, and I think maybe this is not at least the only way. I think technology, with all this information, with AI, with the information that a latent space can give us to us, like what's going on in the new spaces we are founding, I think there is something that can explain some of those big questions of humanity. Like, who are we? What is the connection between us? What is the connection between nature? All this perfection around are patterns, like in the trees, in the sea, why the water falls in the summer and in the winter. Everything is like perfect around. And I think maybe technology can start to explain why there are things happening. And in my case, my goal from my artistic project goes to try to understand, because I was born in Bulgaria and I grew up in Spain. So I'm like Balkan, but I'm Mediterranean, and it's a mess. And I thought maybe I can try to understand better myself, trying to use AI. And for example, I'm training a lot of data of all the influences that Bulgaria has, maybe like from a lot of years ago, like thousands of years, then the Soviet era, then a lot of political stuff that bring the country today. And I'm trying to mix it with this history in Spain. So I think maybe mixing the music, the style, the fashion, and the history of people, mixing together with AI, I can just find something. I don't know what. So that's why I think it's not like maybe making more human things, but trying to use those technology to have more information about things. So
that reminds me, and I'm sure you will agree with me. It reminds me the approach of some surrealist poets. The surrealist automatism technique. Basically the idea that you write something without actually thinking about it, but then the result, which wasn't 100% crafted, works like a mirror somehow, and basically shows you things about yourself that you weren't aware of. I don't know if it makes any sense. So I think it's quite interesting to see AI from that point of view, as a sort of a mirror we make following our own concepts, and I suppose, and also look for details, look for things that we didn't originally plan. I don't know if it makes any sense.
Yes.
Absolutely. I think that from this point of view, there are some connections again between your practice and Paul's practice, in terms of looking at nature, and while looking for surprising knowledge is amazing.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting what you, Paul, said, that you mix oil painting and images and data and machines, and I think there is something, I don't know what is, but there is something, because I also work with clay. I plot my work, I generate it with generative algorithms, then I plot them, and then I do clay, and I want to draw these patterns in the clay, because, you know, at the end we are physical beings. So I think there is something in this connection on trying to know each other. And yeah, when you said about your cats, and I have now new cats at home, so I feel like so close to your work, and I think there is something in this, in this game.
That was super interesting. Thank you. So, in the discussion regarding the use of AI in art, as you are probably aware, there is always a question that seems to attract much attention. Mainly, can AI be creative? As you see, only simple and easy questions this evening. I would like to know your opinions about this, in particular in relation to your roles as, not your roles, to your, to your practices as creatives and artists. Can we start with Iskra?
Well, I think it's a very easy question, Filippo. Thanks for asking that. But I think, I think it depends on what is creative for us. Because if it's like I am a creative one, if I do something beautiful, maybe it's a definition. But I think if we are looking for the new Van Gogh, for example, I think it's not possible. And it doesn't need to create a new one, But if we think in terms of this capacity of finding new connections and new ways and bringing light to some dark places that we cannot realize by ourselves, this is creativity for me. And if the machine can have this capacity of bringing so much information and then finding the real important thing and connecting with other things, and then the human take this to create something, I think, yes, machine can have creativity, but it's a different one. It's not the classical one. So
it's a different definition of creativity.
Yes. I think it depends on the definition of everyone. So for me, it can be creative, but doesn't mean that the machine can paint. We don't need that, maybe.
Oh, okay. What do you think, Garrett? Do you agree?
I think I'm going to agree with some of what Iskra said and disagree with other parts of it. I think what she said about this idea of, are we going to get the next Van Gogh? I don't think that's anytime soon. That's not coming at the moment because we're not there with that technology yet. Perhaps at some point in the future. But I think the question itself is deceptively simple. I think there's a number of issues. I mean, as Iskra was talking, I was listening to the words that you were using. For example, the idea of things, that creativity is linked to things. If we kind of look at what creativity is, that link between creativity and things is problematic in itself, because creativity is the creation of something original or new. It doesn't necessarily infer that it has to be a material thing or even a non-material thing. It can just be a concept. So I think you've got a whole spectrum of what is possible to be creative, and this is why we see the word creative is applied to so many fields now. People who are working in banking, they're told be creative, you know, where traditionally we wouldn't have thought about creativity as anything to do with banking. So I think it's a word that's incredibly complex and very difficult to unpick. So for me, I think we need to be very careful about how we assign what creativity is. That it needs to not be linked with things, materiality, non-materiality, or if you look at the history of art, all this discussion that happened in the 20th century in particular around the object. It needs to be very disconnected from that. Can AI be creative? Yes, I think it can. I think it has that potential. I don't think, like Iskra, I don't think we're there yet. But I think the more precise question is, when there is creativity with an AI, if there's creativity in an AI artwork, who's being creative? Is it the AI, or is it the artist stroke programmer who's made the AI, or is it the collaboration of the two? Or is it some other factor like the environment it's running in? There's so many different factors that are playing within that scenario, essentially. And I think that's effectively the entanglement that's happening there. You've got the artist, you've got the tools, the medium, and you've got the artwork. And if you look at the history of art over the 20th century, it plays into a discourse that's been happening for at least the last 80 years, where through conceptual art, through so many different movements, through early new media art, where they were talking about, if I take a library and I incorporate it in my code and it's been programmed by somebody else, is it my artwork or is it someone else's artwork? This issue comes up time and time again in art. So there are elements within this which are not new questions, they're the same questions being rephrased within these new technologies, and they have slightly different slants, but there's an immense amount of complexity to it. And then there's also the issue of, when you're talking about creativity, what is the artwork? Because if we're talking about artworks as, again, things, objects, materiality, is it that final thing, or is it the process towards getting that final thing? Why when we talk about GANs making image-based works, for example, why is it the final image that we consider the artwork and not the performance of the GAN actually generating all of the images up to that artwork? That's equally as interesting.
It's a bit like reenacting a performance, I think. I think there are some connections between AI-generated images and, and let's say traditional, I'm not sure we can call them traditional because, they are not that old, but you know what I'm talking about, let's say, late 50s, early 60s performances where you had, the artist providing a set of instructions, and then, you had
art by telephone, for example.
Yes, for example. And also, I always think about one work by, I always pronounced it MoCDA. I'm not sure it's the correct pronunciation, but I see all of three of you nodding, so that's a yes for me. Again, yes, his work he made in collaboration with this agency. For the public who may don't know what I'm talking about, basically at a certain point, MoCDA, who was one of the most influencing artist of the 20th century. Basically, at a certain point, I think it happened when he was one of the teachers at the Bauhaus. Basically, he called this this company, and basically he provided a series of instructions. Basically, he said, "Look, I want this image, and I want this square on the top of this triangle, and I want this triangle of such and such size," and so on. But then he left so many details to to the makers that in fact, when the results were printed, you had like 5 or more different versions of 5 or more different outcomes of the instructions he provided. So in that case, I think it's the same situation we may have right now with AI-generated images. Namely, again, as you said, Gareth, are the actual finished works the results of this process, the work, or more the fact that the artist, provided the instruction and so on and so on?
I completely think that's the case. I mean, if you think about a GAN and you think it in relation to the practice of somebody like Sol LeWitt, his work was all about producing iterations of images, various combinations. So he's like the proto-human GAN in a sense, So these ideas are not massively new. They've been around, but we're seeing them in sort of different lights and different angles. And I think that's very interesting.
What do you think, Paul? Do you agree with any one of us, or?
No, I think indeed that part of the question around creativity has been answered in the late 50s for music, early 60s for visual arts, especially with works by Yanis Xenakis, Vera Molnar, Manfred Moore, all these pioneer people that understood that the machine could be an augmented arm, could be a good assistant, provide propositions that later would be chosen based on completely subjective criteria. So indeed, I agree to say, even with Sol Lewitt, etc., a lot of conceptual research has been done at that time. And for me, it's always a great source of concern not to reinvent what already exists. And I think in this case, we don't have much to say. Why is it such a huge question with AI? Is that we can't say that AI is just a new brush. It's more than it's a sophisticated tool. It's not just something that enables us to go on a new media. It's not like an NFT. It's much more complex because we interact with AI. And as Gareth said, at some point we have to gather data set, we have to train it, we have to tweak it, push it to the limit, etc. And it's not just a brush you take, and also you have a distinctive aesthetics I always try to get away from. So it's a lot of work. If we try to answer this question, I believe creativity, and sorry, I will talk like an engineer for a few seconds. For me, it's like understanding what was done before. So there's an idea of being knowledgeable, at least a little bit about the history of art, and at least accumulating historical data. And this, an AI can do much better than us, actually. They can ingest much larger amounts of data that we will ever be able to do. And to build on this historical data, you need serendipity, you need to propose something new, maybe in terms of concept, as Gareth said, or maybe visually or whatever. And in this case, AI with GANs there is a little bit of serendipity that is offered, but the problem is this type of GANs, they are as good as we are. If we use garbage to train these GANs, we will get garbage. There is no epiphany, there is no crazy way of finding fascinating concepts with AI. So for me, AI is not a creative agent. It's not a full medium, but it offers a new way to create. Instead of starting from zero, we can curate data set, and it's the first step of curation. And then we get propositions from the various algorithms, and we curate them through a second round, and we can later tweak it depending on the process. And that's what I love, because, sorry, I rebound a lot on what Gareth said, but I think it was very thoughtful. He said at the beginning that now AI is more accessible, and it's true. There are many platforms. You can almost log on for free. You have collab notebooks. You can do many things, even though you're not a coder. And it's very interesting to see that now you can, I'm not saying you can be an artist without knowing anything, of course not, it's a part of a research, it's sometimes it's a life choice, etc. But at least you can get on board without fearing, the blank page syndrome. So you can, gather inspiration, create mood boards, get propositions, build on it, and do as many forth and back trips between the real and the data space. So that's what I love about this process. And sorry, I'm going to share my screen just to show you one thing. It's another project I did, not even with AI, with Markov chains, which is like a very basic algorithm. And if there are mathematics students from the university, you will know it, obviously. And I created a poetry book last year. And what I did is that I trained Markov chains on many poets that I love, and I generated some kind of raw materials, so it had the taste of these poets, it had the atmosphere, but it was not written by these poets, Okay. And I did a lot of craftsmanship afterwards, because I browsed these thousands of pages, I extracted crazy sentence, some kind of epiphanies that the algorithm generated, I assembled them into poems, and later on the poems became stories, and the stories turned into a book. And why do I talk about this? Is that without this type of collaboration with an algorithm that is much less sophisticated actually than an AI, I think I wouldn't have been able to overcome this type of blank page syndrome, because I respect too much poetry. I read a lot. I spend my time discovering new poets, etc. And for me, having at least an AI to propose ideas and to be able to build on it, it helped me a lot on an artistic and personal side. So again, you have to find your own process, but that's the idea I really wanted to share with you. It's you have to find your own way to collaborate with AI, but again, and Robbie Barra, a pioneer in this field as well, says AI is not a creative agent. And sometimes in interview I quote him, I have nothing more to say. It's not a creative agent. As you said, both of you, it can be creative, but it's not an agent. We are the agents. And the technologies, they are at our service. It's not the opposite.
We're effectively all saying the same thing. I mean, the only slight distinction I think I'm saying in mine is that I think that I would not like to close that door. I think there is the potential at some point in the future, but you know, it's not soon. We're far away from it.
You never know, indeed. Yeah.
Mm.
And do you think it's up to AI or up to the one designing the AI to reach that point?
That is part of the problem, and this is where I absolutely couldn't agree more with Iskra, in that I think a lot of the thinking about how we manage to sort of, let's say, initiate AIs that would be creative is that we're anthropomorphizing them much too much. We need to think about these potential intelligences as not being human-like, as being something else. You know, some other sort of entity that can be creative in its own way, and then by doing that, we can shift the idea of creativity as not being this human-centered idea of what creativity is, but expand it to, you know, what might creativity by some other entity incorporate. To me, that's the only way I think we can ever get beyond this sort of discussion of, will machines become intelligent? Will they be like people? That impasse will never happen. I don't think they'll ever duplicate us. It won't be about that. It's about thinking about it in a different way.
Moving on, how would you define your approaches to the technical aspect of making AI-generated art, or let's say, you know, automation-generated art, let's say? Do you think that your knowledge in computers and algorithms and networks play a central role in the enjoyment and understanding of your works? I would like to start with Paul.
So honestly, it's a fascinating question. I think yes and no, actually, because I don't believe that algorithms should have such high barriers of entry that only a few chosen ones could use it. I don't want GANs to be like the Vanta Black, you know, the color acquired by Anish Kapoor and that nobody can use. And I know that Joanie Lemercier said some words about it recently. So I don't want things to be like this. But at the same time, I recognize that to be relevant in what you say, you don't necessarily need to be the first at doing something, but at least I see that I need to have a deep understanding at least how to train a model, how to use earlier latent spaces than the last one that just creates the image. I like to push the models to twist them, to code some layers to have what I want in the end. And again, what is generated as a final image, so-called final image by the GAN, for me, it's just an intermediary step of the process. So half of the time, most of the time, I have half of the process that is digital, but then I have to interact with a craftsman, or I sculpt stuff myself. You know, like just to show you in an image, Iskra talked about clay recently, and it was I love this intervention. You know, like here, for instance, it's engravings I made on clay, and actually the letters are generated by a GAN based on botanist writings. It's like the writings that botanists and use to annotate flowers when they gather herbariums, etc. And I created some kind of an alphabet, and I use it to hide text and etc. And for me, you know, it really represents the process, because half of the effort is to train a GAN. It's costly if you have your own GPUs or your network time, etc. But the other half is to find clay, is to engrave it, to cook it, to find if it's relevant to create the final object. So again, I think it's both the enjoyment comes from both activities.
Paul, sorry, can I ask you something about that specific work? It's something I always wanted to ask you, and I think this is the right time to do it. How did it feel to, to write those characters? Because, at the end of the day, let's say, A, B, C, D, and so on, and, and all the other characters, used all over the world, at a certain point where somehow, they have been developed over the centuries or, over millennia. So, of course, they are somehow designed to be, written by hand. So I just wonder, how did it feel like, to translate that with your hand on, on a very physical?
No, it's very moving, obviously, because you're in touch with the matter, etc. And when I created the alphabet, I intentionally used some transparent letters, so the vowels, for instance, they're kind of transparent. Of course, it's AI-generated shapes, but you can decode them. And some of the consonants, I completely went berserk, if you will. And it's funny because maybe he's listening to us today, but there is the studio manager of Refik Anadol called Rishad. At some point on Twitter, he spent 24 hours trying to encode this language. Actually, because I at the time I released the work, I didn't really explain the process intentionally, and he thought it was a sub-Saharan language. He convoked friends that were experts in this field, and I love this aspect also, that you can trigger adventures based on new shapes, new forms, etc. So that's the idea also, to create intermediary languages and where you're working.
Thank you, Paul. What about you, Garrett?
So this question about algorithms and computers playing a central role, for me, technology, computers, code, algorithms, all of that, they're part of a wider set of mediums, tools, forms, and environments. I mean, since the discussion of new media art has been around, for 25 years now, those have all sort of kind of collapsed together. To sort of separate out mediums and tools and environments is extremely difficult. They're all kind of one and the same. So I don't see technology as something that's specific in my practice, that is important to the sort of the enjoyment of it, to the making of it, for the audience necessarily. It's not a central role per se. My practice is more concept led. Networks being the concept that drives it forward, and it's not what everyone sort of assumes. It's not, when I say networks, it's not the internet either. It's the wider idea of networks. So I try to almost follow, in a sense, that idea of form following function, except in my case it's form following concept. It's essentially that what I do in my practice. And for audiences then, audience participants or users, whatever you want to call them, that are looking at the artworks that I create, I try to make them so I try to position them in a way so that they can understand those key concepts that I'm trying to get across. That there is, to a certain degree, an appreciation of what's happening, the sophistication, the complexity that's there, but not necessarily to the point of admiration of the code or understanding of the code. That's not a prerequisite in any of those situations. I think to a certain degree, the work that I create has a certain technical sophistication, a certain complexity about it, which is not just computer sophistication necessarily. It's a philosophical sophistication and a art history sophistication that's there. And I think audiences need to be engaging with that to a certain degree to be able to understand the works that I'm making. And I don't necessarily always make it easy. There's usually, when you look at my work, there's usually reading involved, which is part and parcel of it.
I wonder, Garrett, given your experience as as teacher and professor, I wonder what was your experience, with I don't know how young your students, tend to be, But in my own experience, it happened very often that I had like 19 or 18 years old, interested in making new, quote unquote, new media art, and very often the very first question was, can I make new media art with something that is not a computer? Like, do I need to use computers to make relevant new media art? Which was, a very tricky question, because of course, not very tricky, because of course the answer was no. But I just wonder, from your point of view as teacher, how you explain this to, to very young people, that are starting a new path in their lives. I don't know if it makes any sense.
I understand. I mean, it's part of the sort of student mentality that I run into time and time again. I get a combination of factors, actually, because I've taught across different countries. They are radically different in their attitude. So, for example, when I taught in England, I get a lot of students who are technology phobic, completely phobic of technology. They don't understand code. They're utterly in fear of it. But then students that I've taught, for example, in India, there's a great admiration of the code, and they want to get in. They want to really make stuff with code. And it's a kind of a reverse situation, because it's their knowledge of maybe the sort of art and design references that might be useful in conceptualizing a work that are slightly more absent than it might be in the English students, for example. So there's a very interesting comparison there. For anyone trying to get into new media art, I'd say, well, probably dump that title would be the first thing. Don't use new media art, because I really like the title, but it's laden with problems. It's like postmodernism. It's eternally wrapped up in this idea of the art that you're going to make within it has to be new. It has to be linked to things like innovation. You have to be using the newest technology. And as Paul pointed out earlier, that's not really what artists do. It's not about using a cutting edge technology and being the first. It's about experimenting with it and showing it in new lights, or revealing things that people haven't seen in new ways. And the technology might be around for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and you can still do that. So I don't think necessarily work within that restrictive title. And the other thing I'd say would be take an approach that will think long term. If you link your approach, your practice, to a specific technology, you can only really count on it for 5, maybe 10 years. That's it. Then your practice will need to change. So don't do that. Link your practice to a concept or a set of concepts, or maybe even processes. That's absolutely fine as well. So that as technologies evolve and shift and develop and so forth, you can transition across things very fluidly, and the concept will follow you. So you will end up with this body of work, which is very holistic, essentially.
I 100% agree with you, Garrett. That's a very, that's a very useful suggestion for for anybody willing to to experiment and make art. I absolutely agree with you, Garrett. Iskra, again, what's your I wonder what role your knowledge in in computers and AI plays in in the way the public is supposed to enjoy your works. Do you think that if the public knows more about how you make your works, would feel more connected to it, or it's not very relevant?
Well, I think it's I totally agree with what Garrett just said, and I think it's about, you say concept, I say story. I think it's the same. Like when I show something, it's about the story. Time ago, when I was doing data visualization, was like in the beginning, and I remember I'm not a coder, but I had to code with D3, which was a very difficult library. You had to know a lot of mathematics, and everyone was like, "Oh, it's so difficult." I didn't know how to code. I just wanted to draw something, and I just used to go to the website and see how to put this equation to this thing. So I'm always like behind the technology. If I need something, I just go to see how to do it, but I'm not a technologist. And if I want to do something in clay, I go to the shop and I buy a wheel and I put YouTube and I start to learn how to do clay, you know? And I think sometimes in my work, I do a lot of work with algorithms, but I used to end up in a very simple thing. I can show you now, if I can share screen.
Be my guest.
Yeah, let's see if I can do it. Toda la pantalla. Okay, so you can see my screen now?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so for example, I used to end up with this kind of birds, which I don't know why I cannot.
Maybe it's just taking a while to...
Yeah, maybe. Well, yeah. So this is, for example, a result of an algorithmic work, which is very simple. It's actually a bird, you know, and I don't want to express like this is so complex to do. And actually it is, because I mix a lot of different algorithms to create that, but the result is very simple. Sometimes I train GANs and I want to find some relation between things. And I want to express this as the concept, like this is something difficult, this is something new. I want to create a new face, and actually the face is not beautiful maybe, but the process itself, I am telling this story. I'm trying to create a new face. Today, the faces are ugly because we are not like so well with this technology, but this is my story. But sometimes if I just want to create something more simple, or like here is again the bird, but I wanted to show another thing. Here is a feather. Well, so it depends on what I want to say. And I'll start this here, for example, if you can see now the video. Yes. Yeah, I would like to share with you later the link with that. But for example, if I take off the sound here, here is the process. And as you can see, I work with, here I train the GANs, you can see the code, you can see here the new media artworks, but also I paint with this, and I create those physical things. Here is my work with clay. So the algorithms are just, when I want to create something that I need the algorithm, I do it. But if not, I don't. So it's not the central part of
your
my work.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So it's not the protagonist. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally understand what you mean. And speaking of which, this is actually something that we mentioned earlier when we talked about Moholy Nudges experiments. I wonder, and this is a question for all of you, when the public looks at your AI-generated works, how do you think, this is again a very simple and easy question for you, how do you think we should enjoy it? Is it more about the final result or the appreciation of a structure, the calculations that made it possible, and the randomized solution that the machine generated? Iskra, I'm thinking in particular about your generative nature series. Can you tell us what you think?
Yeah. For example, yeah, I was sharing the bird was from there, but. Yep. Yeah, this collection, for example, yeah, this was the first collection I shared as NFT, and here you can see, like, I think they're very organic patterns on those drawings, and I was trying to find, you know, like this, like looks like a flower, for example, for me, or this like also a spring, or I don't know, this is a kind of a sun or something. So I really don't need, like, I think this is a very similar question to the previous one, like how I want people to react to my work, right? So I just want them to feel that I'm trying to create a connection with nature. Because, for example, when I create those birds or these flowers or something, sometimes I want to do that. Sometimes it just happens. and I just code something, and then I start breaking the algorithm until I get something very, very weird. And sometimes I come up to something very organic. And then for me, the exercise is going back and see, okay, what happened in my code to create a flower? And if I go step like in the inverse, I don't know, I can tell a story that maybe flowers are created by these kind of equations. So when I share my work, I always want to share this story with people, like how everything is created around. So I just try to experiment with the algorithms in this way. So for me, it's not, so it's not so important for me to like, I do this and this is very difficult, because I don't think it's so difficult. So for me, it's like just create this communication with people, and I love when that happens. Sometimes people react to that, and I don't know. So yeah, it's like a dialogue.
It's pretty much. I mean, it's very much about interpretation, isn't it? It's like a Rorschach spots, basically.
Yeah, sometimes looks like that. Yeah.
Garrett, of course, your works feel, of course, you are much more interested in the process than the final result, and that's something we talked about earlier. And I wonder whether you can expand on this and basically how this relates to your research in networks. For example, the work you showed us, the very first work you shown us earlier. As you said, it's about networks, but not just in terms of digital networks, but more in we are talking about big scale networks and small scale networks. So yeah, I just need to I just wonder if you think that I wonder if you feel that the public should. I know that enjoy is a very tricky term, but especially in relation to some works like yours. So at that point, I wonder whether the public should, again, enjoy, experience, understand your works from that point of view, rather than from a sort of aesthetic perspective. I don't know if it makes any.
No, it does. It does, absolutely. I mean, I as Iskra was talking about her work and talking about how she wants people to appreciate it. I think in the work that I showed earlier, The Last Straw, which I'll just briefly bring up again so that I can sort of remind people
for the ones
of
who are late to the party.
There we go. Can you see it now?
Yep.
So just to emphasize the point I'm going to make is that this is not a pretty work. This is because this is sourcing images that are in the public domain that I have no control over. It's fairly ugly as an image to look at, and I don't mind that at all, because the work is not about these individual images per se. It's about what the work is suggesting, that as Iskra said, that story, in a sense, that larger narrative. Although I generally tend to not think in stories. I generally tend to think in this idea of how do I get a singular concept across, and then allow the audience to evolve that concept in their minds into a story, into a sort of larger narrative. So that's what I'm hoping the audiences get out of the work from me. The process is extremely important. Much of what I've done over the last 12, 13 years is performance based. So I tend to frame a lot of the works I do as either performance or performative in how they unfold, they evolve over a period of time. And I don't mean it's sort of a narrow vision of what performance is defined as more traditional performers, where it's this idea of the body in a space and you're co-present with your audience, but instead this idea of taking core principles of space, time, the body, audience, and then manipulating them. Within new media environments, within networked environments, we can particularly manipulate space and time in very interesting ways. So to be able to do performance in those contexts is, for me, extremely interesting. The Last Straw, I consider it as a performance work in how it plays out through Twitter. As I said earlier, it's for an unknown period of time. It's to an unknown ending, in a sense. It stops when it is either found all artificial straw or natural straw, but also in how it plays across all of the technologies. As I said, I consider the connection of those technologies as a network in themselves, but also that they're performing with each other in a way, that they're processing certain parts of the data, handing it to the other one, and then moving it forward until it's finally shown to the audience. And without the connection of these technologies working together, the work wouldn't work. It wouldn't function essentially. So the last straw wouldn't be possible. So the GAN visual classifier that's used in the last straw within the work is, in a sense, for me, it's a network, and that's how I frame it. But it's also working within the work itself, which is a network, which is then in turn working within the internet, of course, which is a network. So as you rightly identified, I'm all about networks within networks within networks. And of course, the subject, the Anthropocene, people talk about Gaia, for example, and they frame Gaia as this sort of large ecological network. So that can be considered as a network as well.
That was fascinating. Thank you, Gary. Paul, your potential herbariums, which I hope you can show us later, is an array of works leveraging both artificial intelligence and physical herbariums. How would you expect the public to enjoy this series?
So I have prepared a little visual. So the Potential Herbariums series is a very important series for me that I've been working on for several years now. So indeed, I gathered, and more precisely, we scrapped a lot of herbarium planks, from many websites across the world, and I mixed it with my own herbariums coming from. I was born in the mountains, so I gathered plants in the mountains, and I mixed everything to create a data set. And from this data set, obviously, I trained a GAN with a lot of computer power that allowed me to generate what you see on the left. So it looks like herbarium planks, but...
Oh, sorry. I think you didn't share the screen. Sorry.
Sorry. Oh, you're completely right. Sorry. So that's what you see here. Normally it works now. So,
here we go. Thank you.
So the idea is that on the left, you can see, if you will, the raw materials. So it's pure GAN generation. So on these generative raw materials, you can see plants, but that have almost anti-Darwinian shapes. So, like the stems, they go in circular shapes. You have impossible plants, leaves, shapes, etc. It's super fascinating. You also have distorted colorimeters, which are another signal that is for me super interesting because it references a little bit the work of Aurélie Nemours that she did with pastels back in the 60s as well. And you have the botanist writings that I previously talked about, and that led me to generate my own alphabet, if you will. And what I do for the Potential Herbarium series, and especially the work on the plants, is that I extract interesting shapes of plants, and then I compose images purely subjectively, but based on these generations. And then I turn them into either paintings or NFTs or both, depending on what is relevant. And for me, the relationship with the audience is a very strong question, of course, but I don't have any expectations, honestly. What I do is a type of research, and I try to build, I would say, a type of vocabulary that is very personal. I'm not saying aesthetic because it's more than just visual. It's an array of text, of visuals, of works, of intentions. This panel also is part of this research, obviously. In the end, I create exhibitions, either for real, that's what is going to happen in September and December in Paris, but also in the metaverse. Sometimes I create a small museum. That's what I did, for instance, with my brother and an agency we created called the Ben Builders. And we created this museum in CryptoVoxel to feature a little exhibition. So it can be also in the virtual space, but I'm not really too much worried about how the audience would react to it, because what I'm trying to do is to welcome this audience is inside an ecosystem of, I would say, I'm not saying honesty, but an ecosystem with a language that is deployed. And I hope that they will react in any way. But I don't want to send too much intention or direct too much the audience, because I'm at the same time super interested in how they react to plants, because some of the audience that is maybe more technical will be interested in the shapes and how the Gans invented the new type of plant shapes, and more poetic audiences maybe will say, okay, this is what the plants would look like if they chose to commit suicide, for instance. So it's a complete different approach, and both of them for me are relevant, So I'm just creating an ecosystem, presenting it to an audience, and then I'm super happy to interact, but in a very discreet and subtle manner. At least that's what I try to achieve. So that's my answer. I know I was a bit long, but it's
no, never too long, Paul. Never too long. Thank you. That was very fascinating. I have one last question for all of you before the Q&A session, and I know that there are already a few questions for all of you / us. Again, very simple questions, as you see. What do you think is going to be the future of the relationship? Not the future of creative, use of AI, but what may be the future of the relationship between artists and AI? So, as I said earlier, if in the 19th century, no painters or no sculptors would have ever said, my brush is is my friend and he's my ally, and I make works with him, unless he was a very interesting person. Generally speaking, now there are more and more artists, as you know, that may say, actually, I collaborate with the AI, as, for example, Paul, you said many times this evening. So I wonder if you think that this relationship will evolve towards certain paths in the future, or if actually it will stay like this forever, or at a certain point computers won't work anymore, and we will just go back to brushes and stones and all of that. What do you think, Paul?
So I will try to answer fast, so in 3 points, because sometimes I can be very structured. But I think AI is becoming a commodity. That's my first key point. It's becoming a commodity, even at the stage early of implementation. So for me, AI art will not necessarily be a thing. It's more than just a medium, as we said. But I already I'm asked to collaborate with, for instance, innovation companies. In France, I collaborated with a house called Nelly Rodi, and I helped them generate patterns using GANs. So it's becoming a commodity, and there is no huge technical barriers to entry anymore. So it's a huge trend in the future. And Mario Klingemann collaborated with Valentino, Robbie Barra with Acne Studios. So just in the field of fashion, it's already becoming a regular tool, like any other, like a mood board or whatever. The second aspect is curation, and it's for you, Filippo, because now these tools, and with the network effect, we see that sometimes there are more people that want to write than people that want to read. There are more people that want to speak than people that want to listen, and it's completely okay. Everybody can express themselves, and I'm fully for it. I work a lot on Hic et Nunc with NFTs, and this community helps helps many people get on board and propose their work. It's very important. But when you have many people speaking, curators are crucial to at least guide the way, and also divert the vision from people that speak very loud towards people that are maybe more discreet or maybe more overlooked, but that have a super interesting proposition. So I think after commodity, curation is a super huge trend that will happen in the future, and we could see the starification of artists. Now with NFTs, there is the starification of collectors, but I think in the future there will be star curators, and I'm sure, Filippo, you will be one of them. And lastly,
I'm not going to pay you, Paul, for this.
And lastly, just to take a word from Garrett, concept, it's super important. In the future, it always has been important, and it will be much more, always more important in the future. As far as I'm concerned, I'm always very keen on not reinventing what already exists. So it's okay, I think, sometimes you don't have to be afraid. Don't fall into FOMO. Take a long time to read. And take the time you need to find your voice. Many artists started at 40, 50 and did crazy things. Just to quote a few, Agnès Martin, like Aurélie Nemours, François Morlaix, many French people. Sorry, that's what I have in mind, top of mind. But many people took a lot of time to find their voice. It's okay. But I think it's very important not to reinvent what already exists. It's part of the research. It's really part of the research, and these three elements, commodity, curation, and concept, for me, it's what I think all the time. So
thank you, Paul. Do you agree, Garrett?
I think similar things to Paul. I think at the moment it's very difficult to gauge what's going to happen with AI art. I think that the whole thing, as I said earlier, because there's this entanglement between artists, tools, medium, environment, that you can't necessarily separate out the relationship between the artist and the AI without also talking about the medium, the tool, and all of that. But I think, as Paul rightly said, take your time, because at the moment there isn't an awful lot of critical distance from what's being developed, and what is being developed is largely being led by scientists without a lot of consultation with people from other sectors, without artists or anybody else effectively. So they're driving that momentum. So I think artists sort of need to stand back, watch what's happening, think about it, be critical of it, see where they can take it. But what I'm hoping it does in the future, I'm hoping that the relationship that will develop is that it will connect more firmly with some of the developments that have happened in the 20th century, that it will link to those discourses about art and machines, that have come up time and time again through Jean Tinguely, for example, Nicholas Schaeffer, Paul Desmond Henry, the open work, Umberto Eco, for example, solid weight, all these kind of things that, over that century were talking around the same things, the same issues from a variety of different angles. And I think AI art has that potential to connect with those discourses and take them further. Right? That's what I'm hoping will happen.
I agree with you, Garrett. And I think, if I can add one last thing before going to Iskra, I think that I'm always fascinated by the fact that more often than not, you have this new generation of artists, working with digital tools that seem very influenced by artists who, from artists who are of course very famous, very popular, the kind of artists that always, make, big sold out exhibitions. So for example, you have Van Gogh, you have Picasso, you have Matisse, and so on and so on. But in fact, it seems like, you have this generation that is somehow more often than not influenced by, I don't want to say the wrong artist, but you know what I mean, like by artists who weren't really that interested in the process, in the same process, that is effectively used when you collaborate with AI. So I'm very interested in seeing how this relationship with art history will develop. So not just the relationship between artist and tool, but also, as Paul said, if someone else already opened that door, why you should go back and reopen it? You should probably look at what has been done in the past, and somehow keep opening those doors rather than go back and forth. What do you think, Iskra? What do you think may be the future of the relationship between artists and AI?
Well, I think this is the question. So I think it's very, very difficult, and it's a long talk. And I think I don't know. But at least I think I can say just that in this thinking that we are creating new machines and new ways of connection with people, I think the artists have a great role in this work to define the shape of these new creatures or something.
Mm-hmm.
And this is from the side from the artist, but also I think it's a great time for the art, because I don't think it's a very revolutionary time, but it's a changing time. And the same happened when, I don't know, the pigments were discovered or invented, so it changed the way people could paint. And then the photograph camera also changed things. And now something is changing, and I think there is something, and this is very long to talk, but just to say, I find you mentioned, right, that everyone can connect with great artists, but maybe you can just spot someone who is not like maybe the best one. But I think this is a key point in this changing time in history, because every time change because of the society. And if we look back, we come from, I don't know, 10, 15 years of a lot of information, of Twitter, of Instagram, of I can ask Obama something and maybe he can reply. And this crazy thing, now it's concreting on this thing. And I don't know how to express that, but we are, I think, facing a period of time that, like, it's not a concept art, it's not a modern art. Now it's something that the art itself is this amazing connection and freedom and need of curation, as Paul said, so it's crazy. And I don't know.
I think I know what you mean, Iskra. It's a bit like when the Romans built the first roads in Europe, if you know what I mean. Like, it was a technology at the end of the day that allowed many people to be connected with each other, and that definitely influenced that influenced culture, that influenced landscape, that influenced the way people made and understood art. I'm sure that happened because, of course, at that point, someone who was in Rome, I don't know, in January, was able to, to replicate, to copy what he has seen there, I don't know, in Germany or in Spain 3-4 months later. And, that's a very interesting
actually, if you
aspect.
can follow like Kandinsky, you can see the Paris period, then you can see the Russian period, and they were also always traveling where things happen. But now things happen in the computer and in real time, all the time. So
it's the network period.
Yes.
and I think the art is there, and the connection with the machine, it's I don't know, there is something big there, but I don't know what is.
I think you're exactly right, Iskra. I don't think it's AI specifically is that period. I think that period has been the last 25 years since effectively the internet. From there on in, there's been a whole cascade of things that, technologies have happened so rapidly that in previous times, you're talking about spans of maybe hundreds of years for those technologies to come along. And I think for artists, it's a unique opportunity. And I think AI has a part to play in that.
Thank you all for this super interesting talk. I wish we had more time, but of course now it's time for the Q&A session. So I don't know if Antonio wants to. Oh, here we go. Hi, Antonio. Turn the microphone on.
Great, really.
Here we go.
Yeah. Sorry. So I was saying it was just great, and thank you all. So we actually have a lot of questions, so I will start immediately by sharing my screen. So I think now, so I started sharing, and now you should see.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so you see that there was the option of voting for the questions. So we may start from the most voted one that received 5 votes, which the question is, are the current aesthetics theory enough to reflect AI-generated art? Which thinkers do a good job understanding these new artistic concepts?
I think, I don't know, maybe I can start with a very short answer and then maybe each of you may want to add on it. I think that, yes, at the end of the day, as Gareth said, this process, and with this process, I'm not just talking about AI, but I'm talking about, in a general way, how the internet and how digital culture actually developed and influenced the way people make and understand art. I mean, there are many media theorists and many aesthetic philosophers who actually, spent a lot of time and, wrote many very interesting books that, in fact, provide interesting perspectives on what's going on. And I think that's actually one of the main points of being interested in contemporary art, and, in particular, again, I don't really like that term, but let's call it new media art, specifically because there are so many, I don't want to say new things going on, but there is a lot of experimentation right now in this field. And it's interesting to read. On Monday you read an article about something, and then on Tuesday you read something else from another person that says the complete opposite of what the first person said. And I think it's much more interesting from, if you are someone interested in art and in aesthetic and in technology, I suppose, to actually come up with your own answers if you're looking for answers. And actually, speaking of which, and then I will leave the words to my guest. At the end of the talk, I mean, not this evening, but in the next few days, and Antonio will nod because that's what we agreed earlier, we are going to provide a reading list and a list of links of artists and books we mentioned this evening. So, of course, if you have any further questions specifically about any works or any theorists or any philosophers we mentioned this evening, please feel welcome to get in contact with Antonio or me, because you can find me on Twitter, and of course you can, I suppose you are very welcome to get in contact with Gareth, Paul, and Iskra as well, if you want.
Maybe just to complete the answer of Filippo to the question in terms of current aesthetics theories, etc., I will answer very fast. But what I can say is that over the past 50 years in the art world, there was only a limited number of galleries and thinkers that supported the computer art and the AI art. So what triggered mass adoption is after 2018, the first sale at Christie that was a bit controversial, but of the obvious group that triggered maybe more interest of the regular galleries on AI-generated art with more or less success. Of course, in the past, there were many initiatives, but it's still not studied as an aesthetic, and there is a peculiar aesthetic with GANs, etc. And I don't read a lot of articles. I read some on ArtGnome. I read some of the Uncanny Valley, which is a section of Flash Art in which Filippo writes. But not that many thinkers try to delve into this peculiar concept. So I think it's going to be done in the future. But I always try to push for more articles about it, more books to be written, because, as we said, I think it's a tool that is here to stay.
Mm-hmm. Do you agree, Iskra? What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. And actually, I don't want to repeat just to get with more questions, but yeah.
Gareth, do you want to expand on that?
I think, there are already books on AI art. There is a book by Joanna Zielinska, which is called AI Art, Machine Visions and Warped Dreams. And it's actually freely available. If you go to Open Humanities Press, you can just download it. So, anyone who wants to sort of read up on it can do so immediately on that. But I think as well as looking at what is being written currently, and the majority of what is being written you'll actually find in academic papers, things like that, as opposed to books. I think rather than just looking at what's currently being written, also look at what's been written about the predecessors, about artists working with machines and things. There's several books about the development of robotic art and drawing machines that were developed in the UK, for example. There's books about Nicholas Schaefer. There's lots of things you can read. You read Umberto Eco's The Open Work. all of these kind of things touch on these same issues. So that will give you a very good grounding of what kind of discussions should be had about AI art, what kind of concerns are embedded within it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I can expand on that very quickly, in fact I can say that I started studying, let's call it again, I don't like the term, but you know what I mean, new media art back in in the early, let's say more than 10 years ago. And in fact, more often than not, in order to understand or to provide, to find an interesting perspective on on what was my passion, I in fact had to look at what was written when computers didn't even exist, and that's because as we said many times this evening, there are some concepts, there are some processes that that started way earlier than the invention of the first computer, and that sometimes it's really helpful to see people writing about automation and about what happens to an original image when it's replicated thousands of times. Like what happens at that point is that for who is interested in art history, this is very simple, but I believe that if you never read anything related to art studies, it may be very useful for you to look at what some writers, which again we will share with you in the next few days, wrote about the early development of the industrial context, and especially in relation to how the early 20th century artists actually reacted, answered all the questions that somehow the industrial society posed to them. Antonio?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I can just give you like you can just read read out aloud the questions and
yeah.
Okay. So this is the next.
Okay, so making errors is a way to learn new things. That's very true, and find out unexpected results. Mr. M. Paul. Okay, Mr. M. Paul, has it happened that GANs led to newest results because of fallacious algorithms patterns?
To answer very quick, it happened, but also what I did sometimes is that I messed with my data set to intentionally get messed results and then build on it. So sometimes also, you get some kind of glitches in the outcome of the GANs. It gives you ideas, then you change your data set, you retrain, and you converge towards something that is interesting. So indeed, that happens often. I'm sure Garrett and Iskra maybe can confirm.
No, you're right. I mean, you said in an earlier conversation we had about, that there's been this identification of GANs that discriminate against people of different colored skins and so forth, and how that error hasn't been corrected yet. And I know there are artists who have worked with that, who've manipulated that to their advantage within artworks they've made. But there are other undocumented things as well. Like, for example, a lot of the visual GANs where you can render images, there is, when you input, particularly when you're working with something like Clip, when you input language that it doesn't quite understand, its fallback behavior is very interesting. Its fallback behavior is to write it in text in the image, which I think, no one has really talked about this yet. I wouldn't classify it as a bug.
That's true.
It's very, very interesting, and I'm playing with that at the moment. I'm looking forward to other artists kind of identifying it and saying, what can we do that's clever with that? That language in, you expect an image out, but in fact you get language in an image. How can we play with that in interesting ways?
Iskra?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the expected and the mistakes or the errors in my work is like what I do, and I build algorithms, and when something looks like it works, I destroy it and I build on that, and I think that's part of a huge part of my work. And sometimes unexpected is like the most interesting part of the result. So of course.
Thank you. That was a very interesting question. The next one is for Gareth. Gareth, do you think that the Western students' technophobia is just a modern educational issue or a cultural deeper one?
So without trying to go too far down that road and make it seem like I'm targeting English students, which I'm not, I'm just sort of mentioning a cultural observation that I've made. I don't think it's a fault with the education system per se. I think it's more connected with the culture of the UK. The culture of the UK is, and I don't mean this in a negative sense at all, but it's very orientated around a very modern, a hyper modern, a sort of a pop culture, and it has been since the 60s. You know, there's modern music sort of drives it. There is design is a big thing in the UK. Graphic design in particular, that visualness within design, a lot more so than in other countries. It's developed in a way that is much more embedded in society. And I think some of the students that I have taught are caught up in this sort of very modern desire of, they want to engage with what is the new, the modern, the current. They're not interested in the old, but they're also jumping into it far too quickly. They're not understanding that, you know, when you program this thing, whatever it is you're programming, there's an awful lot of complexity, and it takes effectively years to learn how to program something that is relatively complicated. So I think there's just a lack of knowledge, effectively, of, you know, you've got to build up essentially that it's like all learning, you know, whether you're learning a language or you're learning to program, you need to go through the motions to be able to understand.
If I can say something, if I can add something on that, Gareth, I think that in Italy, especially in schools of fine arts, and I'm sure this is not something that, you know, I'm going to say something that won't make new friends. But yeah, I mean, in Italy, I suppose that, you know, we have, I don't want to say the same problem, but I want to say we have the same situation. So we have, you know, especially in schools of fine arts, in new media art courses, you have many, and I know that because I used to be one of those, that, you know, are very interested in the, you know, in the theoretical side of using, you know, technology. But yeah, I mean, I would say that out of 20, you probably have like 2 that are, you know, super skilled, you know, in using such and such software, such and such hardware. So that's, you know, that's something to think about for another event, maybe. So moving on. So what do you mean? Oh, I think this is for Paul. What do you mean B models becoming accessible? What is needed for a new model for you to be usable? Is a public GitHub repo enough?
The answer is public GitHub repo is not enough to be accessible, because you need to be a developer. So we are in a computer science environment, so that's why you ask, and I understand. What I was saying is that, just to quote one example, there is a website called Playform. And on Playform, you can have free access. You can even try for yourself, and you can train a GAN. So you won't have the deepest models and the craziest computer power, but you can get a data set, use it for training, and generate any type of output. That's what I called accessible interfaces. And you know, there is a word that you probably know, it's WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. And I like the idea, you know, and that's the type of tool I presented to some companies that wanted to train GANs. You know, I don't have time to implement GANs for them, etc. And at least it's a first way to get on board and see if this could be an interesting way of working. So that's the type of thing.
And again, I think that, you know, looking at what Iskra said earlier, I think, you know, it's very important to have not only models, you know, accessible, but also, you know, actually scripts and algorithms, I suppose. As you said earlier, Iskra, it was very important for your practice, at least, you know, when you started, to have something already available to study, or to have something to make your first works. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I was exactly now thinking about this, because making this world accessible for me, it's of course about websites and repos and, I don't know, free guns to be trained, of course. But I think it's accessible when people know what is this about, and again, what is again, and what is a Latin space, and what can I do with that? Because for example, when I started coding, as I said before, I am not a coder, but I knew what I needed, and I knew what I wanted to do, and I sorry for that. I needed something to gather all this data, and the tool or the library, in fact, I think it's not like so important to that. I think yeah, people should have, and there are tools to learn kind of a theory behind these processes. This is accessible for me, and once is this, a lot of people would create tools to be easier. But this dissemination and this explanation of what is this about, I think it's very important to get more people into this.
I think just a small comment to add as well about this idea of models. If somebody is a little bit concerned about this idea of using models that are pre-trained by somebody else and you don't know how to do it, or you don't want to work with a model which you might perceive as limited, and when we say limited, it's got potentially tens of thousands of images within it. But anyway, if you don't want to work with that, direct your interest more towards something like Clip, because what Clip does is there are no models. It's using the internet as its model, all the data that's already on the internet. So you don't have to train it. You can jump straight in and actually start generating work from language to visuals or various other combinations.
Thank you. I think we have enough time for the very last question. So in your quote-unquote art world, and I'm going to stop you there, my friend. There is no art world for me. In our art world, I wish. No, I'm sorry. No, seriously, no. Art. I just hate the term art world. In your art world, quote-unquote, are there any people who look down on AI-assisted art and do not think of you as an artist and author? What would you tell these people? I will just leave this question for you. Iskra, if you want to be the first one to answer.
Yes, of course, but they are not anymore my friends, so no, yeah, sure. Well, I have a lot of discussions with people around who is the artist, who is not, is the machine doing the work, the NFTs are killing the art, and yes, of course, and I think the point here is just not take so seriously these things, and I think, for example, if you are not like okay with technology doing art, it's okay, we can discuss, but there is like two very strong
perspectives.
Perspectives, and it's like we have to fight. No, yes, of course, there are things that I totally agree with people who says, yeah, but the algorithms does this, and I have to say yes, okay, but I have to guide the algorithm. But I understand. So yeah, of course, I face this situation, but I think it's totally fine.
If I can add something about what you just said, the example you just provided, when you say, okay, it's true that it's technically the algorithm making the work, but in fact, I'm the one scripting the algorithm. Again, if we go back to what we said earlier, we mentioned at a certain point the land art, regarding Garrett's work, and I think that again there are some similarities between how or performance art, because technically you have the performers performing your instructions, but practically you are the one that provided the instructions, isn't it?
Yes.
So I mean, at the end of the day, nobody. I don't want to say nobody. Remember the names of the performers, but more often than not, you remember Pane, Abramovich, Vito Conci. I mean, you remember the names of the artists, not the actors, if it makes any sense. What do you think, Garrett?
So I'm a little bit confused about the question now. So in this question that came up about the art world and people's opinions about AI-assisted art, I think yes, there are people who look down, but they tend not to necessarily be the art world, the people you'll meet in galleries. I mean, if I had somebody who came up to me to start a conversation like Iskra said, where they wanted to have that conversation, that's already a positive because they want to engage with the idea.
Yes.
I find that the worst critics actually tend to be connected with academia. There are artists working in academia and are running art journals, for example. So you run into them during things like peer process reviews, those kind of things, where there's an awful lot of snobbery around not just AI art, but anything working with technology. They're stuck in paradigms where they're thinking about ceramics or paint, and that's it. You know, the art world has not moved on beyond that. So yeah, those people exist out there, but you won't encounter them in those art spaces. They're more behind closed doors.
And if I can add something else about what you just said, Garrett, something that struck me when I was working for a big museum in London was how important was for the English public an Italian family that worked and lived in the late 15th century, namely della Robbia. Basically, that was a family that made amazingly beautiful ceramics, like statues. In 25 years, I never heard of them. And, I've been studying art history for a long time at that point. And it was very fascinating for me to know that, that was, it wasn't technically fine art, but, that was defined as art in the UK. While in Italy, when I went back home for the first time after, my first trip to London, I checked all my art history books, my Italian art history books, and I couldn't find anything about that family and their works. So I think there is also a cultural, it's not just about media, but it's also about how different cultures perceive what is worth to be called art, if it makes any sense, and especially fine art, if you want. What do you think, Paul? Oh, sorry, please.
Go ahead, Paul.
No, it's a very interesting question, but I mean, just like many people, I guess, in my life, I had so many people looking down on me, and especially saying, that I couldn't do certain things all the time. And at some point, it depends on the relationship you have with what you create. For me, maybe it's the first time in the conference where I don't agree with Iskra. For me, I take what I do very seriously. Of course, not in a pretentious manner, but for me, it's monacal almost. So I spend a lot of time, just like everybody, but in my atelier, and I keep working on these things. For instance, what excites me about NFTs is how to inject poetry in the crust of NFTs. So I have like weird, I have preoccupations that are okay for me to be alone with at midnight. So in the end, it's okay to engage with critics. That's what I do also, but it's not a real concern. Honestly, my most important concern is to be able to keep learning, to be honest with what I do and what I provide as an output, because for me, the quality of the final product is super important. And afterwards, you can't control everything. And as soon as the works leave your atelier, it's always very difficult for me, but they're not mine anymore. So when I sell a work, of course, I keep defending it. And the pieces I showed at the beginning of the conference, now they're in a collection, so I shouldn't even maybe talk about them, but I love them, so I should keep talking at the same time. So, again, indeed, there are, as Garrett said, behind closed doors, people that don't support you, etc. But find your allies, build a network. You can do it on Twitter now, as Iskra said previously, and leverage on this and create collective initiatives. And that's what
just one thing, Paul. I just wanted to say that I totally agree with you. the point is that when you feel like so strong, these new channels, this new way of do things, and NFT, and I feel it's so strong, and I'm like you, I go to sleep at 4 a.m. because of that. But the thing is that when you go out with people, and sometimes they're like so against this thing, and so against technology, and so against everything. And I'm not saying that maybe if you talk longer, they can maybe say, okay, I didn't know that. I don't know. It just, for me, it's like so great to have this discussion, but not taking it so seriously. I'm against, just feel free to do whatever you want. And so that's why,
agreeing
I
to
just want
disagreeing. That's a very French perspective, isn't it?
I mean, that's what we do, artists, as well as making art. We talk about things. And I think that the worst situation you can be in is where you encounter somebody and they just shut you down and say, no, sorry, technology is not art. Art doesn't deal with technology. That's the worst scenario. It's not the person who wants to have a conversation with you about it.
That's absolutely true. Especially because I think that, with no technology, there wouldn't be any art at all, because, brush is technology, canvas is technology. Your hand is technology, perhaps, if you're using, a glove, or even if you're using, your very long nail, that's still technology for me to a certain degree.
Yeah, and when you go to an antique museum, every new movement in the antiquity was triggered by the appearance of pigments or a new type of sculpture.
Or a stone,
That's
all human endeavor is technology. We don't identify as humans until technology comes along.
I have nothing more to add. It was.
This is the peak of the evening, Antonio. After this, we can't say anything clever. There is nothing more clever than this.
It's actually back to the Daedalus world, because as we talked during the preliminary study for this conference, it means at the same time, as you said, Antonio, technology and art. So it's. Thank you for this fascinating
talk. So I guess this is also the right time to close because of the coming back to the introduction. So now the discussion is ended, but there is an after talk. So we can all having a more like an informal chat at the networking platform, which is WonderMe. You can see the link to this platform in the banner that appeared, and you will see also in the YouTube chat. So anyone who wants to join and keep on the discussion, you're very welcome to join. So this was our second and last Daedalus episode before the summer. So we will have another episode after the summer, and the topic would most probably be journalism if everything goes as planned. And but this episode was great. It was really nice to have all of you, and it was really, really interesting. And thanks again to everybody. So we can all join now the WonderMe link. And once again, thanks.
Thank you, Antonio.
Thank you very much.
It was really interesting. Thanks.
Thank you, Iskra. That was amazing. Thank you very much. And see you later, probably.
See you later.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.